disappointing start to AFCON 2023 for Ghana, losing their first match of the tournament 2-1 to an impressive Cape Verde side. The result was all the more disappointing given Egypt's draw with Mozambique earlier in the day, which had given Ghana the opportunity to take pole position in the race to get into the knockout stage. Unfortunately, Cape Verde were by far the more impressive team on the night and thoroughly deserved their 2-1 victory, which leaves Ghana now having to get probably 3 or 4 points to get out of the group, including likely getting some sort of result against an Egypt side who will be keen to make a point after their draw against Mozambique. The result and performance was at odds with the positivity around the squad when it was announced about an hour before kickoff. I think it represented a step away from Ghana's more conservative approach under Chris Hughton, with Majida Shumeri named alongside Idrisu Baba, with Ghana's most positive and progressive centre-back pairing in Alexander Jiku and Mohamed Salisu named alongside one another, and the sort of versatile, interchangeable front four that has become an increasing feature of Ghana's play under Chris Hughton. However, if there were concerns about the Ghana team, they were probably twofold. The first of which was a lack of cohesion with the team, predominantly stemming from the fact that so many of the players have such a dearth of international minutes, including as pairings. Notably, Majida Shumeri has barely played with Idrisu Baba. I think they have maybe at most 90 minutes with one another, but I think it's less than that. And Majida Shumeri himself is very internationally inexperienced. Mohamed Salisu and Alexander Jiku have also not played together a huge amount. And the front four is a fairly new combination as well. In fact, Ranford Königsdorf was asked to play the hugely important Mohamed Kudus sort of progressing role, picking the ball up in small spaces and carrying and dribbling and linking in those number 10 areas, despite the fact he was only starting his second international game. Match fitness was a part of that concern too. Mohamed Salisu has been injured for most of this season and is only just coming back into match fitness, was asked to play a very important role and a difficult job in this system. Majida Shumeri has unfortunately also spent a lot of time injured this season, but again was asked to play a key role, whereas and goalkeeper Richard Ofori hasn't actually played really at all for Orlando Pirates this season, but was not only starting the game for Ghana, but was also the captain on the night. Ultimately, it felt like, whilst it was a brave decision, there was potentially some significant risks taken in terms of players' match fitness, the cohesion of the team. And I think ultimately they showed on the night. The other concerns with the team was potentially with a lack of creativity. Part of that was stemming from the lack of cohesion in the team, with, for example, players in combinations that they haven't played with before, so not being completely familiar with one another's preferences and styles. But the other issue was that there wasn't really a kind of top-class creator in the attacking group. Now, this is a sort of wider issue in the pool, but I think it'd be fair to say that the front four of Joseph Pencil, Königsdorfer, Jordan Ayew and Semenyo is lacking creativity at all those positions. I think Joseph Pencil is a good creative player, but I think he's at his best when he's not being asked to dribble 1 versus 2 a lot. He's better more running into space and creating from in those situations, particularly in transition. I think Jordan Ayew, as good as he is as a dribbler, and he is also a decent crosser, is not the most creative player, and certainly I think can be a little bit slow to recognise passes. I think Ranford Königsdorfer is much better as a link player than he is as a creator. And whilst I think Antoine Semenyo is a good creative player, particularly as a striker, I think ultimately there was often a lack of targets for him when he was crossing into the box as well. So I think that's something that needs to be worked on. I think it goes beyond Chris Hughton, but I also think that there are certain decisions and personnel choices that have been made which have exacerbated those creativity concerns, including in the front four. Ultimately, that lack of cohesion that I've talked about, that lack of experience, potentially lack of match fitness and lack of creativity was borne out in the game. I thought Cape Verde were the more cohesive team with a plan. They played with confidence. There was some really nice football actually at points of the game from them. And you could see, I think, that they were more confident in their plan. They actually had 15 returnees from their previous AFCON squad, and that previous AFCON squad I think was 27 or 28 players, whereas Ghana only had 11 returnees from their previously 30-man AFCON squad, showing I think that Cape Verde have a significant amount more continuity in their team, and I think that showed on the night. I think it was fairly easy for them to play through Ghana's press, as it showed on that first goal, but it had been sort of threatening for most of the half up until that point, and they continued to threaten throughout the game. Actually, is that Ghana's press was unable to prevent Cape Verde manoeuvring the ball from left to right, and ultimately then once they did that, able to exploit Ghana's sort of shifting and the spaces that the players talked about last night, the spaces that were emerging between the lines as a result of that. I think the first goal was a repeat of issues that we've seen against the USA, for example, but also in other games against Madagascar. We saw it against Namibia. These are issues that have occurred fairly frequently, actually, under Chris Hughton. Partly think a lack of cohesion, but also I think that there are issues with the pressing and the coaching of the pressing as well. It'll be interesting to see if Ghana can overcome and improve as the tournament wears on. I also thought for the first goal that Richard Ofori could have done better. I think he made some technical errors when he was sort of setting and then diving for that shot, and it was a long shot, and I felt he could have done better than he did, and that affected his ability to reach the ball and parry it more clearly away from goal. But I think there were multiple issues on that goal, so I don't think it can be pinned on any one player. I thought there were progression issues. Unfortunately, despite naming a more progressive team, that the team actually was less effective at progressing the ball than they have been. I think again that's a little bit about a lack of cohesion, about players not being comfortable with one another. I think the movement patterns are a bit basic. I thought there was an issue with the spacing of the team, which really allowed Cape Verde to kind of really cram bodies into sort of more central areas, particularly on Ghana's sort of left side, where Ghana were trying to do quite a lot of their ball progression with Jordan Ayew, Koenigsdorff and Semenyo into moving into those areas, getting around Majid Ashimera as well. And I think that made Cape Verde's life a little bit easier than perhaps it might have otherwise been. Ghana were very dependent on Jordan Ayew as that progressive receiver, and I think they need to have a little bit more variety, need to be a little bit less predictable. But at the moment they are a little bit predictable, and I think that's unfortunately a product of that kind of lack of playing time, lack of cohesiveness that we've seen. That it's not just a Chris Hughton issue, but it's kind of a longer standing issue with squad selection, with player management, talent ID and profiling. Unfortunately, Ghana were kind of pretty average creatively, as I've talked about earlier. In fact, they've been fairly poor creatively for the last 24 months, and were actually, whilst they were about average in terms of the shots and the shot quality that they generated, they were still kind of below their normal levels, which are not impressive at moving the ball into the final third and getting the ball into the box. They were more kind of wide orientated than they have been. That's sort of particularly down their left side, and they were also asking Joseph Pansel to do a lot of work 1v1. Ghana, unfortunately, have become very over-reliant on offensive duels to actually create chances for them, and I think, as talked about, I thought, whilst that's all well and good, I think they may have been asking quite a lot of Joseph Pansel in particular in that way, although I think he rose very admirably to the occasion. But I think they do need to do more to get players around those guys, and if they do want to use offensive duels, that's fine, but I think they need to have better structures in place so that players aren't having to go through 1, 2, 3 defenders in order to create chances and potentially create a chance themselves. They need to be able to have more players around them so they take defenders away and make their life a little bit easier, really give them the best opportunity to concede. I thought Ghana did look a little bit better from set pieces than they have been. Obviously the goal came through a good set piece, good delivery from Jordan Ayew, and there were a lot of players in the sort of target area, which suggests that they've been working on them, which they've done actually around the World Cup as well, I felt. And that's a positive, if that's something that they can use to kind of mitigate their lack of creativity, lack of progression elsewhere on the pitch by being good at set pieces. That'll certainly be a step in the right direction. But ultimately, it's still sort of issues with progression, with creativity that I think partly, as I've said, have been about cohesion, partly about structure, partly about personnel, and I think those are things that still need to be worked on and worked out. I thought there were some positives from the game. I thought the interchangeable front four that I talked about earlier continues to be a real benefit of Chris Hughton's approach. I think it's a throwback to kind of older Ghana teams where we typically saw strikers who were comfortable drifting into wide areas and crossing. We also saw wingers who were comfortable coming inside, whether it was playing as more playmaking players or whether it was actually trying to sort of run in behind and be a goal threat as well. I think we still continue to see that, and I think that's something that needs to stay in place. And I also thought that the centre-backs actually looked quite good, despite the fact that they're asked to do a huge amount defending in this system. They're asked to defend actually in midfield quite a lot because of the way the shifting works, and because of the way the number 8 defends in the double pivot. They have to step in alongside the number 6, which is very difficult, and then having to drop back. There's a lot of movement, a lot of quick situational recognition that is being asked of the centre backs, and I actually thought both of them dealt with that very, very well. And actually Alex Giku was absolutely superb on the night and was sort of rewarded with his goal, but I think deserves all the plaudits he got for the defensive work he was doing in space, the work he was doing covering for his teammates, and actually the recognition he showed kind of throughout the game about when to step into midfield and when to drop back. So I think he deserves real credit, and I think that's a positive pairing that Ghana need to continue to sort of lean into moving forwards. Unfortunately, I thought when Ghana kind of got their tails up in the second half in an offensive sense, and when that interchangeable front four was really working at its best, they actually made substitutes which kind of killed all the momentum. I think I sort of had spoken before about the challenges Chris Hughton has in balancing the team. I thought it's the team and the players that they picked means that if they do pick a more balanced starting 11, that's going to be a very finely balanced 11 that potentially, if you make substitutes, has the potential to be unbalanced quite quickly, and that's what we saw. I think the advantage of Joseph Pansel being able to go kind of on 1v1 on the outside against his fullback, on the right-hand side of the pitch, was completely destroyed by Ernest Nuama's being brought on that flank and kind of favouring to come inside without having an overlapping right back. I thought that limited Ghana's threat on that flank through no fault of Ernest Nuama, I felt, but more through the fault of the coaches and the decision that they made in terms of personnel and putting him on the right-hand side. I also thought that Andre Ayew, for all his experience, is a very different player from Königsdorfer. He's not as mobile as Königsdorfer. He's not as dynamic. And I think Königsdorfer's dynamism and ability to go in behind, which allowed Semenyo, allowed Jordan Ayew to drop towards the ball, was one of the things that Ghana kind of benefited from, and really they weren't able to benefit from once Andre Ayew came onto the field. And I also thought that Iñaki is also a different player from Antoine Semenyo. Semenyo's physicality was really causing Cape Verde issues, although the referee was penalising him quite often. His physicality, his verticality was causing them real problems and was giving Ghana the ability to play in someone's feet and let him be physical in those moments, retain possession, roll defenders, link with other players. And Iñaki, again, is a different type of player. So those changes just disturbed the balance of a front four that was, I think, starting to find its feet. And that ultimately meant that Ghana's kind of the attacking momentum that they were generating really fell off. And then Ghana, having become kind of more stodgy, more stolid, more predictable, I think less cohesive, were then ultimately punished by errors. That error for the final, or the series of errors for the final goal, where the throw-in, I think it flicked off Alexander Djiku's head, he just couldn't reach. Mohamed Salisu was unable to deal with it because the ball was bouncing awkwardly and was sort of coming right at him through his legs, and then Richard Ofori was late coming off his line, I think, a little bit, which enabled Cape Verde to poke it home. But it was more of a kind of a team-wide defensive mess-up, basically, rather than kind of one player making kind of one grave error. Unfortunately, it was if anything, it was not an error from Alex Giku that then sort of spiralled and put Alex Giku and Richard Ofori into a very difficult situation, which they were unable to resolve. So I think, ultimately the question is now is where they're going to go from here. They've got to beat got to get a result. I think a draw would be ideal, would be okay. A win obviously would be excellent against an Egypt side who will be keen to make a statement after their draw against Mozambique. It'll be interesting to see what Chris Hughton does, whether he goes back to being more conservative with his team, having seen kind of his attempts to be more positive, in some respects backfire because the team wasn't particularly creative. But I don't think they were any worse defensively than we've seen when they've gone with the double six. And I do think there is more potential in the group when they do play with this more attacking setup to be more of an offensive threat. But it is an issue with cohesion, with playing time. So it's going to be interesting to see what he does, whether he kind of leans into this more proactive, progressive approach with these personnel and gives them more time, which I think, for taking a more longer term view, is the right thing to do. I think really Ghana again feel like they're at the end, they're at the sort of very start of a playing cycle. Another AFCON, AFCON 2019 they felt like that, AFCON 2021 they felt like that. Now AFCON 2023 it feels like there's a bunch of new players in the team sort of learning how to play together. I think really for the long term, Ghana need to lean into some of these younger guys and give them a chance to learn, give them a chance to play international football. And although it feels like a sad thing to say about an African Cup of Nations, that's really that this AFCON needs to be used as a launch pad for future tournaments. And I think that's sort of my view, and I'd like to see them do that. But it remains to be seen whether they do or whether they kind of prioritise the here and now, maybe do lean into being a bit more conservative again, to the extent that may work, but hasn't been shown to work because their defensive sets haven't been good anyway. And I don't think they've looked progressive with those guys. I think they have potential to be attacking and effervescent, which is what we all want to see. So it'll be interesting to see what they do. I suspect they will try and be very conservative, eke out a result against Egypt if they can, and then perhaps approach the Mozambique game with a bit more verve. But I would think it may well serve them in good stead for that final game to give the same group of players the same chance against Egypt. Encourage them to play with a bit more courage, give them another sort of 90 minutes together, give them more time in training, try and develop some of those connections a little bit more. And then hopefully you get into the Mozambique game with those players then feeling a little bit more confident, feeling more trusted, and ultimately feeling like they can play with a bit more courage in that game, because that ultimately, I think, will be the game that defines whether or not Ghana can get out of the group now. And I think Ghana need to be primed. I think they need to be confident, and I think they need to be willing to play with real courage in that match. And I think this group of players, I think that certainly the group that started, perhaps with a couple of tweaks, has the potential to do that. And really it's about, I think, leaning into that, and then hopefully giving them that confidence, giving them that courage, and then using it as a launch pad moving forwards.